Welcome back to this special episode of Defence Talk, Securing UK Advantage, a podcast brought to you by the Council on Geostrategy in partnership with trade association ADS Group and sponsored by industry powerhouse BAE Systems. Our podcast discusses key questions that shape defence, technological and national security agendas in the UK and explores the main themes in British defence in the context of intensifying geopolitical competition. Earlier this month, NATO members and partners came together in Washington, D.C. to reaffirm their support for Ukraine and the importance of the alliance in the face of growing geopolitical tensions. Against this backdrop, in the Euro-Atlantic region and beyond, this NATO summit, in its 75th year, was momentous. For the first time, Sweden was welcomed to the annual summit, having become a member of the alliance in March of this year. At least $40 billion of US dollars of military aid was pledged to Ukraine by NATO leaders, coupled with 20 new security agreements between NATO allies in Ukraine and a path to NATO membership. Simultaneously, NATO began to address China's support for Russia's war against Ukraine, labeling it a decisive enabler of Russia's war efforts. Today, we will discuss these and numerous other outcomes from the recent NATO summit. I'm Victoria Starek-Somolin, co-founder and director of strategy at the Council on Geostrategy, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Ambassador David Quarrey, permanent representative of the United Kingdom to NATO, and Sir Stuart Atha, head of the UK delegation to the NATO Industry Advisory Group. David Quarrey is the permanent representative of the United Kingdom to NATO. Previously, David served as the Prime Minister's Advisor on International Affairs and as Deputy National Security Advisor from 2019 to 2022, and as British Ambassador to Israel from 2015 to 2019. David has served in numerous additional roles in the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office and Cabinet Office, as well as in various UK missions overseas. Sir Stuart Atha is the head of the UK delegation to the NATO Industry Advisory Group. Sir Stuart is also the Defence Director at BAE Systems. Previously, he led a highly successful career in the Royal Air Force, serving as Deputy Commander in his final Royal Air Force tour, focusing on the counter-ISIS campaign in Iraq and Syria and the NATO response to a resurgent Russia. Sir Stuart is also an honorary professor at the University of Nottingham. So, Ambassador and Sir Stuart, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Good morning.
So let's perhaps begin with the backdrop to this year's summit. What were the main priorities going into this year's summit, and how did this summit differ from the previous ones, for example, in 2022 in Madrid or 2023 in Vilnius? Ambassador.
Well, thanks, Victoria. It's great to be here. The Washington summit was a really important moment for the alliance. It was a moment to celebrate 75 years of the world's most successful and longest-lived defensive alliance. I think we should see it as building on the outcomes of the Madrid and Vilnius summits in 22 and 23. And the most important features of the backdrop for the summit were that intensification of geostrategic competition that you mentioned earlier, the worsening of the security environment in the Euro-Atlantic region, mostly driven by Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine and the horrific situation that has caused in Ukraine, and a further sort of tightening up of the cooperation between Russia and China and Iran and the DPRK, which was a really prominent theme of the discussion there. So it was a challenging backdrop, but also very positive in the sense that we had Sweden there as a full ally for the first time, as you mentioned. We were celebrating 10 years of Jens Stoltenberg's extraordinary leadership of the alliance and the selection of Mark Rutte as his successor. And overall, an alliance that is stronger, readier, better resourced and more united than at any time since the end of the Cold War.
Sir Stuart, in your view, what makes this year's summit different?
Well, in many ways, whenever you have an anniversary, it is the opportunity to reflect on who you are, where you've come from, but more importantly, going forward. And I think we look at it through two lenses. One is the national lens, and the other one is through that NATO lens. And I think what made this particularly interesting was having a new UK government and how we play national arguments. And I was absolutely delighted to see the messaging that our government brought into the conversation. I think it was collegiate, it was collaborative, It was about NATO first. And from an industry perspective, if you like, in many ways, that continuity of prioritisation of what NATO means to the UK was really important. As the ambassador says, that recognition that we do live in dangerous times, the urgency of the moment, and therefore the need to act, I welcome. I think there is that continuity, as the ambassador has mentioned, about what happened in Madrid, and for us, from an industrial perspective, Vilnius in particular, and we can come back to that. But it's that final point about cooperation, that strength that is represented by NATO, looking at this as an opportunity, whilst there is lots of political volatility within the alliance, the one thing that unites us is that purpose, which is about protecting and promoting the security of the Euro-Atlantic region.
So, Ambassador, what was decided at this year's summit? What are the key outcomes?
Well, first of all, there was that moment of celebration of NATO's 75th anniversary, and the US did a fantastic job in marking that in a very appropriate way, because we should always remind ourselves just how unique NATO is. 32 allies who have come together, made a sacred commitment through Article 5 to our collective defence, and that's the bedrock of our freedom, of our ability to live by our own values. But it was always important for us and for other allies that this not be just a moment of celebration, but also a moment of substance. So we saw a very substantive package on Ukraine. We had President Zelensky attending again this year. So we moved the language forward on membership. We launched a new NATO mission on expanding NATO's role on coordination of training and equipment for Ukraine. We have a new senior civilian representative in Kyiv who will lead the alliance's work there. We've got a financial pledge. And also, critically, we had announcements on new supplies for Ukraine, including the 5 Patriot systems and others from the UK and others. There was good discussion on Russia and the need to update our long-term strategy with regard to Russia, but also for us to be responding to and addressing the challenges of Russia's increasingly aggressive hybrid campaign within Europe. There were an excellent set of outcomes on the wider transformation of the alliance, and we saw 23 allies now at 2% of GDP or more. We had the new defence industrial pledge, which Sir Stuart mentioned earlier we should dig into, which I think for us was a very, very high priority out of the summit. But also lots on a new cyber centre, on AI and new technologies, helping the alliance prepare for the next 75 years, as it has been so successful in its first 75. And then finally, I think lots of work on deepening our global partnerships. We had the Indo-Pacific 4 leaders there, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and the Republic of Korea for the 3rd summit in a row, talking about the indivisibility of our security and the importance of cooperation, but also the appointment of a new envoy to lead work on the alliance's engagement with the South, primarily Africa and the Middle East. So it was a moment of celebration, but there was also a lot of substance in there across a very wide-ranging agenda.
So let's dig into the NATO Industrial Capacity Expansion Pledge, the one that you've just referred to. So delivering on the NATO Secretary General's words that there's no defense without industry, a NATO Industrial Capacity Expansion Pledge has been published. So Stuart, could you please tell us a bit more about this pledge and why it is important?
Yes, indeed. I suppose before we get there, I think it's really important to recognise actually what was agreed at Vilnius, because I think Vilnius was a real watershed moment in the recognition of the role that industry plays as part of how NATO operates. We often talk about NATO being this political military organisation, as it absolutely is, but I think perhaps what had been underappreciated was the criticality of industry, and I do salute Secretary General. He is quite consistent and persistent about that. There is no defence without industry. But last year, there was that strategic reset in the relationship between NATO and industry. Partly it's because I think and I'm always suspicious of anyone that starts a sentence with the lesson from Ukraine, because often you then bridge into perhaps a particular hobby horse. But what I would say, one of the lessons from Ukraine is the level of risk against military plans that actually sits inside industry, which is not necessarily understood or mitigated. And there have been a number of examples of the challenges that have been caused as a consequence of that. And I think Ukraine, as President Zelensky says, Ukraine's today is NATO's tomorrow. And therefore, from an industrial perspective, there's that, right? One, there is the near-term absolute priority to support Ukraine in what it does. But there is also let's learn from a NATO perspective. What is it that we need to do differently when it comes to the relationship with industry and the delivery of deterrence and defence? Last year, Vilnius agreed the Defence Production Action Plan. The importance of this is far more than the name would suggest. And I think this is one of the challenges sometimes that we have. We think it's a production action plan. Production is a key part of the challenge, our ability to produce at scale and speed that is needed both for what goes on in Ukraine, but also for the NATO challenges in the future is absolutely a key part of it. But it is only part of it. And the reason that I think I particularly I welcome the industrial expansion, capacity expansion pledge is that it actually broadens perhaps the scope of what it is that we're talking about, because this isn't just about the mass. It isn't just about getting more bullets and bombs into our stockpiles into Ukraine. It's also about innovation. One of the things that we have seen in Ukraine is actually the speed, the pace of the development of capabilities and counter capabilities. And I think that industry has an absolute key role to play. So as you look at the pledge, in lots of it, there is the Defence Production Action Plan. As I say, production and supply chain is already, but it's the additional elements, the broadening of the scope. There is also about cooperation and collaboration. And I think this is absolutely key. And the ambassador, I'm hugely grateful because you have been very good at articulating how, as nations, but also as organizations, we need to work better together. Organizations like the European Union, because I do think, times are so serious at the moment that we've got to make sure that we work efficiently and effectively together as a group of nations. And the final element I would say about the pledge, because it is quite broad ranging, is the way that it looks at how society sees defence. That sense of what we are facing is a threat to society which demands an all of society response, and within that the defence sector is absolutely key. And therefore, that recognition, whether it's about investment or whether it's about recruitment, actually defence matters, and and the support of our politicians, as laid out in the pledge and indeed the communication, I think is something to be welcome. The final point, though, these are words, and we need delivery, and we need implementation. We have an action plan. We need to be delivering that action plan. We welcome the expansion as part of the pledge, but we need delivery more than just words.
Sir Stuart, before we move on to a different question, very briefly, you are, of course, the head of the UK delegation to the NATO Industry Advisory Group. And could you please very briefly explain about the NATO Industrial Advisory Group and how does it serve the UK industry?
Yeah, I think part of the challenge when we talk about the relationship between governments, between militaries, and between industry it can be really quite challenging because we use the word industry as if it's a homogenous entity, when in fact it's big, it's small, there's all sorts of competitions that are going in there. What the NATO Industrial Advisory Group allows is a way by which NATO can engage persistently and strategically with defence industry. It's not about particular contracts or particular competitions. It's much broader than that. This is a group that has existed since 1968. It's a group of senior industrialists who volunteer to give their time to support NATO in its actions. From a UK perspective, we're a team of 10. We all have day jobs. We're all working within industry and from a whole range of different companies. And each nation has its own NATO Industrial Advisory Group delegation. It's a forum for exchange, and the ambassador knows better than anyone how important just having the conversation can be. But it's also a source of advice. It's a source of advice, whether it be about emerging disruptive technologies and how do we take the technology into a capability that's relevant to the armed forces. It's a way of engaging with industry without fear or favour of a particular company or not. And so finally that strategic dialogue that I think when we say we need to engage with industry, the challenge is always about how and who. What we have is a NATO body that is formed by a range of experts ready to give that strategic advice as well as provide tactical insights that NATO needs.
Ambassador, this year we've also seen the continuation of active engagement with the countries that are outside of NATO alliance, such as senior representatives from Australia, South Korea, Japan, or New Zealand. So it's a trend that has been continuing now for a couple of years. And I would like to ask you, in your view, what does this say about the growing interconnectedness between the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific?
Well, this was the third summit, as I mentioned earlier, that the Indo-Pacific four have attended consecutively. And I thought, and a number of my colleagues thought, it was the richest discussion of the three that we have had so far. And probably the strongest theme of that discussion was precisely that point about the interconnectedness of Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific security. When I arrived at NATO a couple of years ago, I think some people still felt that if we were looking at the Indo-Pacific, more Indo-Pacific meant less focus on Russia. What we've really seen over the last year is you just cannot separate these things. The communique, as you said, calls out China as the decisive enabler of Russia's war machine in Ukraine at the moment. We've also seen Putin in Pyongyang. We have seen an increase in Iranian supply to Russia. And what all that tells you is not that we are trying to move NATO to become a global alliance or to have a physical presence in the Indo-Pacific. But what it does say is you cannot separate the two. We need to understand the connections between. And also that we have a lot to learn from each other. There are global challenges now, whether it's around technology, whether it's about hybrid, whether it is about space, maritime security, any number of these future challenges, which are coming at us very quickly now, where we have a lot to learn from partners in the Indo-Pacific, and we have experience to share with them in return. So while NATO will definitely remain a Euro-Atlantic alliance, we are not looking to expand to the Indo-Pacific. There is no question that we need to do more working with like-minded partners such as the Indo-Pacific for our mutual benefit in the future.
Ambassador, of course, the cohesion of the alliance is very important. And well, this year we've witnessed some concerns expressed by one member, Hungary, about Ukraine's admission into NATO and also about NATO becoming an anti-China bloc. So how, in your view, can alliance manage these ongoing differences with, well, this country and between its other members?
So we are an alliance of 32 democracies. That is one of the great features of NATO. So inevitably there will be points of difference. But I think if you look back to February 22 and then zoom forward to now, the most striking feature is how united we are. United in our support for Ukraine, united in building out NATO's role in support of Ukraine, in understanding these complex interplays between the Indo-Pacific and the Euro-Atlantic. That is the striking thing to me, not that there are points of difference on this. And in that context, I think it was really important, and it was a fantastic opportunity for the new UK government at Washington, for the Prime Minister Keir Starmer to set out his and his government's unshakable commitment to NATO. We have launched the Strategic Defence Review, which, as Sir Stuart said, will have a NATO-first approach. It will take a really hard look at the world that we are in now and what that means for our defence requirements, but with a very clear focus on NATO as the bedrock of our security. We are hosting the European Political Community meeting at Blenheim, and that will be an opportunity to advance discussion about an EU-UK Defence Pact and about the reset with the European Union that the Prime Minister has talked about in the context of this worsening situation with Euro-Atlantic security. So there are always points of difference within the alliance. We are democracies in the end, but the unity of the alliance is extremely strong. And I think other leaders really welcome the clarity and the determination of that message from Keir Starmer in Washington about our commitment to NATO and the new government's commitment to continue increasing defence investment and to taking forward its strategic defence review.
Sir Stuart, continuing the conversation about the common approach within the alliance, NATO, of course, has a long list of guidelines for standardization across the alliance, but it also perhaps needs more to be done to expand the commonality to include areas such as common parts and supply chain elements in order to enhance interoperability and interchangeability. Is this an issue that still needs to be addressed in your view?
Yes, it is, absolutely. And I think we've already talked about the industrial pledge, the production action plan. If you look in there, you will see there's an intent to get after this because there are some hard-won lessons over the last few years about whilst we talk a good talk about interoperability. And in many ways, in particular, you look at our militaries and their tactics, that they are very interoperable. But sadly, our equipment is not as interoperable as it needs to be. And there are clear areas where we have identified that we need to close with. Each nation having its own view on risk and risk calculus when it comes to certifying equipment is in many ways understandable, but it can give you problems when you're trying to operate common equipment to common standards, and therefore that going after the certification and how you look at the risks associated with the equipment operation and how one nation will take a risk and why that needs to be done separate from other nations is part of the work plan that we have already in place to go after. A wood bridge into the Indo-Pacific as part of this, because I do think that, as the ambassador says, the global threat that China poses, and whilst Euro-Atlantic is a regional organisation, I think the promotion of interoperability between nations and beyond NATO is absolutely a key point. That's why partners of NATO, and they come to the NATO Industry Advisory Group. So the Indo-Pacific Four are represented in that grouping. And I think that there is a role that industry has to play in that cooperation and collaboration. Our militaries are hard pressed, and there's an absolute focus on the Euro-Atlantic. industry has a role to play in terms of reaching into the Indo-Pacific. AUKUS is a classic case in point, but I would also look at the Global Combat Air Programme. There's a conference going on at the moment, an air power conference, where the expert on China said the one thing that we can do to deter China is to support Japan, to support Japanese industry. And I think that is one of the reasons why I think the Global Combat Air Programme is so important. AUKUS is so important, but it's also promoting interoperability within NATO and between NATO and our partners.
Ambassador, since Russia's invasion against Ukraine in February 2022, there has been also much said on the defense spending of NATO members. And we know that 1/3 of NATO members actually still do not meet the target that was set over a decade ago now in Wales, I believe, in 2014, of spending 2% of their GDP on their defense. How can we address this issue? And perhaps also moving beyond that, should we actually increase that target? And should it maybe not be 2% anymore?
So, I mean, first of all, we should celebrate the fact that we are now at 23 allies spending 2% or more of GDP. You know, at the time of the Wales Summit in 2014, it was just 3 allies, which is kind of extraordinary to think about now. But we've gone from 3 to 23. Every single ally has a plan to get to 2% now, following the Canadian announcement in Washington, which is very welcome. But 2 things. First of all, those allies who have got a plan to get to 2% need to do it quicker. And secondly, I think you are right that we need to start having that debate about moving beyond 2%. The UK government has said that this will be one of the issues to be looked at in the Strategic Defence Review that I mentioned earlier, and that it will use that to set out a pathway to 2.5%. Many leaders at Washington were welcoming the fact that we had 23 allies at 2%, but signalling that it is that we are in a world where all of us are going to have to continue increasing defence investment for years and quite possibly for decades to come, given the insecurity of both the Euro-Atlantic and the global environment. So that debate is starting now. I expect it to be a theme at the Hague Summit next year. I don't know if and when NATO will get to a new target, but what is very clear is that while all these extraordinary increases in defence investment in the last few years have been very positive and welcome, we all need to go a lot further, and we need to do it on a sustained basis. And I think that is very important for industry to hear, so that they have the confidence in the demand signals that are coming out of governments and can plan their investments accordingly. So alongside all the work on interoperability and standardisation and cooperation that Sir Stuart has talked about, we must be clear about that ultimate demand signal in terms of defence investment from governments.
Of course, the most prominent security issue remains the ongoing war in Ukraine. And the Washington Declaration stated that Ukraine was on an irreversible path to NATO membership, but no specific timeline was issued. What might this pathway look like?
Well, we wanted to use the Washington Summit to show that Ukraine, that its future is in NATO, that there is an irreversible path, that Ukraine is getting ever closer to NATO membership. We can't put a timeline on it at the moment because Ukraine is in the middle of a live conflict. So it's just not possible to be precise about either the timing or the precise terms and conditions of when that will happen. But it is really clear what the destination is, and that the destination is getting closer all the time. So all these measures that we agreed at Washington, both the language, but much more importantly, the new NATO mission for expanding NATO's role on coordination of training and equipment, the senior civilian representative, the financial pledge, all of those things are moving Ukraine ever closer to membership. And President Zelensky welcomed that package Ukraine. He was also, I think, very pleased with the new air defence systems. And we've got to be ready for this conflict to continue, unfortunately, for some time to come, because we see no sign of Russia changing course. Our responsibility as allies and as the alliance, therefore, is to signal that we are with Ukraine for as long as it takes.
So, Stuart, Washington Declaration also spoke about investments in and support for Ukraine's defense infrastructure and defense industry as a key pillar of NATO support for Ukraine. So, what work is NATO doing to build up and support Ukraine's own domestic industry?
If I can I will come to that, but I just wanted to pick up a point about how much you invest in defence and the cost of defence. Because back to that phrase again, a lesson from Ukraine is the cost when deterrence fails. You know, the amount of money, there's been a 1,300% increase in defence spending in Ukraine. That's the cost when deterrence fails. There is an insurance premium to be paid in peacetime to ensure that deterrence doesn't fail. Bridging into what's going on in Ukraine, and this is perhaps where I can talk more authoritatively if I talk from my BAE Systems perspective, because from a NIAG perspective, you know, we're being broadly supportive of what's going on with NATO, but it's been left to companies by and large from a UK NIAG perspective. And from a BAE Systems perspective, the relationship with Ukraine clearly is important and growing. Our CEO and our head of our business development has been in to Ukraine, have met President Zelensky, and we are looking at what it is that we can do in Ukraine, not just in support of Ukraine, and that involves the building of facilities, whether it's about maintenance, repair and overhaul of equipment. It's there's a range of services that we're providing. One thing perhaps we haven't stressed, we mentioned the cyber initiative that was announced at Washington, but actually there's been a broad range of activities involved with cyber, and from a BAE Systems perspective, that has been part of our contribution through our digital intelligence business. So a number of different strands there, and also not just BAE Systems on its own, it's looking for partnering arrangements so that we can work with Ukraine industry as we move forward. And just that final point about when you do your NATO thing, and this is the ambassador's life, where you sit alphabetically and you have your flags. Sitting as the UK representative between Ukraine and the US when we have these conversations, and when I speak to the Ukrainian and we talk about some of these issues, you know, the importance of what we as industry can do to be able to deliver at scale and speed what they need to defend their nation is brought very clearly and colourfully home to me. We have a role to play and we will continue to do so.
We've covered the outcomes of the summit. We also discussed a number of challenges that lie ahead, but I would like to finish this conversation by discussing the opportunities that actually the Alliance has. And Ambassador, within the next 12 months, what opportunities are there for the Alliance to seize, and what should we focus on?
Well, I think we have a tremendous amount of work to do coming out of the Washington summit. A lot of our focus will continue to be on Ukraine and ensuring that we are doing the maximum possible to support Ukraine and to get them in the best possible position for 2025. We will have many challenges to deal with, including Russia, as we spoke about earlier. But one of the things that really struck me, including from the conversation with the Indo-Pacific leaders, was how many people around the world want to work with NATO. And we are not meeting that demand at the moment. We need to go much further than that. And that was one of the themes coming through in the discussion about the experts' report on the South, how we engage with the South, by which NATO broadly means the Middle East and Africa. That there is huge appetite there for NATO to do more, partly in terms of political dialogue about the shared challenges that we face, but also practical support in terms of areas like defence reform, common challenges, cyber, hybrid that we've talked about already, maritime security, new challenges like space. So there is a massive opportunity out there for NATO to thicken up those partnerships. We need to be clear about what it is that we are offering. because our competitors, the Russians and the Chinese, are moving into many of those areas. Theirs is a very damaging offer. You see the hollowing out of security in the Sahel, for example, that comes when the Russians move in. We've got to be in there with a positive, constructive offer that works for those companies and that helps build security there. In the end, NATO can make a fantastic contribution to a rules-based international order, and that order is under strain at the moment, in many respects due to what the Russians and Chinese are doing. So we need to step up. There are great opportunities out there, but we need to take them over the next year.
Sir Stuart, would you agree?
Absolutely. I think what NATO has delivered over the past 75 years, and I was reflecting when I was in Washington on the 50th anniversary, and on the 50th anniversary I was in the Air Force. I was in a cockpit. I was over Kosovo as the summit was going on. I'm just looking at the world in 99 and then thinking about the world in 24, the ability to predict that trajectory, I think was certainly beyond me. But what that tells you about uncertain futures, and actually when you face that uncertainty, you need friends. And you need friends that can operate side by side. And that talks to some of the nuts and bolts of common tactics, techniques and procedures. And we should not underestimate how important that is. The ability to come together is not just 32. But beyond that, using common practices, perhaps the focus that has been on the military application of force is something that we need to apply much more generally. And within industry, that is what we are absolutely focused on, looking for those common approaches so that we get the most bang for our buck. We don't just look at the efficiency, but we look at the effectiveness of coming together. So to my mind, I think that we've got the right words. What we need to do is to deliver against those words. And we within the NATO Industry Advisory Group are absolutely determined to play our part on behalf of wider industry.
Can I just pick up one of Sir Stuart's points there? Because I think it is really important, that sense of historical perspective. And it was very striking, sitting in Washington, that we already take it for granted that Finland and Sweden are there. They're fantastic allies already. But it's an absolute revolution in terms of their international security policy, their international engagement. We take it for granted now that all these new allies on the eastern flank are there in NATO. And as my Estonian colleague said to me when we were in Tallinn a few months ago, we were talking about Ukrainian membership and how hard that prospect can seem at times. And he said, it seemed inconceivable that the Baltic states would be part of NATO until suddenly it happened. And this is an organisation that people want to be a member of because it provides that security, that ability to live freely by our own values, and also to secure the prosperity that we've seen flowing through those Eastern allies who are now part of the European Union, part of NATO. And so we shouldn't lose, as we're in these summits, you can get very sort of bogged down in the communiques and the particular outcomes, but we shouldn't lose that sense that Sir Stuart really rightly highlighted about the strategic significance of NATO and the fact that people want to be in it, and they want to be in it for a reason. And that's why we should continue supporting Ukraine on its irreversible path to NATO membership as well.
Ambassador Quarrey and Sir Stuart, thank you so much for sharing your insights and for this very rich discussion on a very timely and important topic, NATO in 2024 after the Washington Summit. Thank you for listening to this special episode of Defence Talks, Securing a Key Advantage, brought to you by the Council on Geostrategy in partnership with ADS and sponsored by BAE Systems. You can find our upcoming podcast episodes on our website, and please visit www.geostrategy.org.uk/defence talks. Thank you, and until next time.